Welcome to the Rumi Forum. Today we have with us retired U.S. Colonel Paul Hughes from the United States Institute of Peace. He is going to speak on an American way of peace building. A few words about Paul Hughes. He is the Chief of Staff at USIP. Paul Hughes has previously served as Director of USIP's Nonproliferation and Arms Control Program, the Executive Director of the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, and the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, and as the Director of Iraq Programs in the Center for Post-Conflict Peace and Stability Operations. Prior to joining USIP, he served as an active duty Army colonel and as the Army's Senior Military Fellow to the Institute for National Security Studies of the National Defense University. From January to August 2003, Paul Hughes served as a Senior Staff Officer for the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance and later with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. During that time, he developed several policy initiatives such as the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the Iraqi military. As the Director of National Security Policy on the Army staff from 2000 to 2002, he developed and provided policy guidance for the Army in numerous areas such as arms control, weapons of mass destruction, missile defense, emerging non-traditional security issues, and crisis prediction. From 1996 to 2000, he served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the Deputy Director of the Office for Humanitarian Assistance and Anti-Personnel Landmine Policy, where he led the OSD participation in crafting U.S. landmine policy and the DoD response to Hurricane Mitch, the Turkish earthquakes, and the Mozambique floods. Colonel Hughes holds 2 Masters of Military Arts and Science and a BA in Sociology from Colorado State University. His awards include 2 Defense Superior Service Medals, 3 Bronze Star Medals, 4 Meritorious Service Medals, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, 4 Army Commendation Medals, and several campaign and service ribbons. Please welcome Paul Hughes to the Rumi Forum.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and that's way too generous of an introduction.
I think it's well, it's wonderful, and it shows how much work you have been doing in your life in peace building. So please.
Well, I'd like to take a few moments today to talk about the Institute of Peace and its work over the last 25, 27 years. The Institute has been engaged around the world in doing a lot of peace-building activities in zones of conflict, as I call them. I first also want to thank the Rumi Forum for hosting this discussion. It's a pleasure to be back here again. I'm sorry that Emery was not available, but the duties call.
Yes.
So, I titled my talk today, An American Way of Peace Building, as a play on a rather major study of American military strategy called The American Way of War, which was written back in the 70s about how America evolved as a military power and developed its unique way of winning wars. Fascinating study. But now the time has come, I believe, for America to develop a tradition of peace building. And I'll say this again and again, that the logical conclusion of any war is the reestablishment of peace. And that's something that America has not done well over the course of its history. And we can talk about that during the Q's and A's. If you look at the strategic landscape of the world today, you can find almost 100 conflicts active in some form or fashion anywhere around the world today, whether they are state-on-state war, whether they are insurgencies, whether it's a pre-conflict environment where there is an increasing collapse of a state and what it's responsible for. Each one can pose a threat to the United States, because if it destabilizes a region, eventually that becomes a problem for the United States, because Our economy is globalized. We have issues and interests all around the world. And if a region begins to come undone, eventually it begins to impact something that's important to America. And so it's better to try and resolve these issues earlier rather than later. You compound these issues with the transnational dynamics that are at play at the world today. You know, globalization pressures, climate change, food scarcity, market dynamics, things like that. And all of these begin to become a very deadly mix. USIP has found itself in a unique position of playing a role where it can address these sorts of issues with its expertise and its involvement on the ground. Now let me talk about the Institute as a legal entity. The Institute is an independent federal agency. It does not work for the White House. It does not represent U.S. policy. We work very closely in a complementary way with the Department of State and the Department of Defense, because after all, we are working for the American people. We are completely funded for our operations by Congress. We do not take private donations, and it's important for people to understand this. We don't take private donations for our operational work, because that ensures that we maintain a nonpartisan perspective and focus on any issue at hand. I go back to my days when I was on the ground in Iraq, having to work with belligerent groups. And they're not stupid. They know how the United States works. They know how that Congress funds things. And they know that no American entity can go over there to Iraq without some kind of funding. And they would ask, who funds you? Well, imagine if I said, well, I'm funded by a small private organization that they could easily find out whether it has a pro-Israel or a pro-Arab leaning. You know, that would have affected my ability to work on the ground there, in some ways, catastrophically. But by having Congress fund us, that shows the American people are funding us, not one particular interest, special interest group, okay? So that's important for people to understand. We try to empower people with knowledge, skills, and capacities so that they can assume ownership of the peace building in their part of the world, wherever that might be. And I'll talk some more about that. We have 4 basic goals. We first seek to enable, to improve, to enhance the American government's ability to manage conflict before it actually blows up into violent conflict. We recognize that conflict is part of the human condition. The question is, can that conflict be nonviolent? And if so, how do you resolve nonviolent conflict before it gets to a violent stage? And if it gets to a violent stage, how can we mitigate that violence and try to pull it back? And if there is some success in that, how do you then deal with the post-conflict challenges? Because as I said at the start of this talk, you know, the logical conclusion of any war is the reestablishment of peace. You know, somebody has got to be there to see it through all the way. You just can't assume that peace breaks out on its own. So we try to enhance America's ability to manage violence. And by doing so, we try to reduce the cost to the American taxpayer. Because if we can take care of these issues before they break out, or even through our other means of dealing with things after violence breaks out, as long as we can keep the American military from deploying, that saves a lot of money for the American taxpayer. To put things in perspective, the first night of bombing in Libya by NATO cost more than $100 million. That would have funded the Institute of Peace generously for 5 years. You know, so there is a cost trade-off there. And as I said before, with our work to aid the American government to reduce costs, this leads to the third goal that we seek to achieve. It enhances our national security. It has a direct benefit for Americans here at home. And finally, if we can do all of those three previous goals, then the fourth one is we save lives and we save societies from being destroyed. And if we can manage to do that, then we have succeeded far beyond our wildest expectations. Today's world has many drivers of conflict in it that we have to contend with, and part of our job is to help identify what are those drivers of conflict. First and foremost, people need to recognize that the state, it will remain the primary actor in international relations, and state interests will tend to predominate over other interests when it comes to issues of conflict. You can pick any conflict in the world today. They're not going to be arguing about who has the best football team or who, you know, sings better or anything like that. It's going to be tied in some form or fashion to the interest of a particular state who doesn't want something to happen or does want something to happen, because they deem it vital to their survival. And states will continue to do what they have to do in order to survive. We always have to remember that in this business. I've talked about the problems of globalization, but there is a new dynamic that has emerged since the end of the Cold War that continues to drive conflict, and that's the notion of identifying with non-state goals, purposes, organizations, sectarian groups, ethnic groups, whatever. You know, one of the things that's unique about the United States is that somebody can come here and become an American citizen, and everybody will say you're an American. They don't care where you're from. They don't care what tribe you came from or what religion you hold. You are an American. And in all of my travels around the world, I have yet to find another country that that does the same thing. If you go to France and you're from Albania, you're not going to be a French citizen. You're going to be an Albanian who just happens to be living in France. And this holds true through a lot of different regions in the world. We also have the pressures of increasing international criminal activities for a variety of goals. We also have non-state actors now who are trying to affect change through violence, Al-Qaeda being the leader of that. We are also threatened with the proliferation of arms, both nuclear and conventional arms, especially in the continent of Africa with conventional arms. We have regions that are marked by porous borders. Anybody can walk through the borders. Heck, here in the United States, people cross the borders all the time, and they're not stopped, challenged, checked. You know, so that opens the door for nefarious actors to get through. And then we also have the issue of, in conflict zones, of increasing numbers of refugees and internally displaced people, which again stress the infrastructure of a state to deal with more mouths to feed, people to house, and things of that nature. Many states in the world who are facing challenges to peace right now usually exhibit deficits in at least one, if not more, of the following 5 areas. Security being the obvious one. You know, something's wrong with their security situation because there's an increasing tendency to act out violently. That could be the result of a second problem, a deficit in the rule of law system. People don't have equal access to the rule of law, or they feel like they're being set aside by society, by a judiciary. It's also a lack of good governance, especially in the Middle East, you know, where we have seen it played out in the Arab Spring, where countries have overthrown bad governance systems and are trying to figure out how to do better. In fact, today in Egypt, they're electing some people for the first time in the history of Egypt, I guess going back centuries. The pharaohs didn't get elected, as I understand it. Economic instability. If people don't see that they have a piece of the action in the economic system of their country, they can't provide for themselves, their families, their futures. And if they can't do that, then they will do something to change that situation. And then the social well-being. Is there access to the important resources for citizens, schools, hospitals, clinics, things of that nature? Are people denied those things? Those challenges, those deficits in security, good governance, rule of law, the economics system, and social well-being, those 5 pillars define what makes a stable society. And if one of them comes undone, it's easier to bring the whole house down. And so these are what we look at when we look at a country in conflict. Now, we try to seek to redress those or resolve these issues, these deficits, in our, what I call, an American way of peace building. We look to try and shore up the people's view of legitimacy of their government. When you think about many of the problems today in the world, they are tied to the local people refusing to see their government as their legitimate ruler. And as long as they see a lack of legitimacy, then they don't believe in the rest of the things that a government, a sovereign actor, is supposed to do. We also seek to put political primacy ahead of military solutions. You know, as General Petraeus said in Iraq when he was the commander there, we can't shoot our way out of this war. And he said the same in Afghanistan. He's absolutely right. You can, and anybody who has dealt with an insurgency understands this. You cannot shoot your way out of an insurgency, because insurgencies are all about legitimacy. It's not about military victory. It's about who do the people believe represent them. We also seek, as I said earlier, to enable the state, or whoever represents the state, to assume full control and ownership of the problem-solving process. That is extremely critical, because we don't intend to be there doing it for them. Our work is through indigenous people. When we train people, it's by training Iraqis, for example, so that they can train other Iraqis. We don't put Americans up in front of groups of Iraqis and say, this is what you must do. That doesn't sell. That's not convincing to them. And we also seek to transform the violence. If there is a violent situation, we try to transform it into one that's more controlled and has a better chance of becoming a post-conflict environment. By doing this, or to achieve this, we seek to empower local, regional, and international stakeholders to help prevent, mitigate, and resolve the violence. We try to do it by using innovative techniques and practices, or learning new techniques and practices, developing them as we go, and also leveraging technology. We also seek to professionalize the field of peace building. We want to create peace builders in the land that's in violence, so that we can back off, but there are still people there doing the job. And then we also want to create an understanding of this kind of work that people can do. Some of the ways that we have to challenge or to create this environment for peace building is, first, we've got to develop local trust with the people, the belligerent parties involved. And that involves not only developing trust within the country that's in conflict, but also within the region. Studies have shown many times that if regional neighbors do not respect the peace building effort in a state, then that state will remain violent for many, many years. We could look at the situation in Afghanistan today and the fact that there are insurgent hideaways in Pakistan. And as long as Pakistan doesn't take care of those sanctuary regions in Pakistan, Afghanistan will remain in violent form for a long time. We also seek to open up and maintain clear lines of communications between the belligerent parties. That can be very challenging in some of these regions, especially when security is weak and some of the people we need to talk with are constantly being assassinated, as is happening in Afghanistan. We also seek to establish a multifaceted approach to the issue. We want to share lessons that have worked in other parts of the world with the peace builders in this new zone of conflict. We also train civil society organizations because civil society organizations generally know best what's going on at the local level. We also seek to establish interfaith dialogue because faith-based or driven violence is some of the most intractable kind of violence to resolve. When somebody believes that God is on their side, they cannot be wrong. And that removes all chance for compromise. So there has to be an interfaith dialogue process set up. And then we seek to work with the youth as well, because they are the future. They are the ones that have to understand and work at the peace building challenges over the long term. To accomplish this requires the support of the media. We can't have the media ignorant of what we do, so we work very closely with them. And as I said, we do a lot of training with local people, with civil society, and with the government officials involved in this. Some of the work with civil society tries to adopt a long-term view where we teach them how to apply for grants so that they can become self-sustaining. It's part of our capacity building process. You know, because if they can go out and find grants on their own, then we have successfully built an organization that can sustain itself, and that's important. So, with that quick overview, I would just say that there is no cookie-cutter approach to peace building. Every peace building situation is unique in its own way, and it requires experts who can go in and do an analysis of the conflict, see where the leverage points are, take advantage of them, and begin to work with the local people to try and create some kind of sustainable peace. The Institute of Peace has an academy for international conflict management and peace building that offers a wide variety of courses that teach people to do these sorts of tasks. We offer courses here in Washington, D.C. We also send trainers out to the field wherever they're requested to do the training in the region. But the bottom line is, peace building is tough work, and it's certainly not for the faint-hearted. You have to go to where the conflict is taking place if you intend to affect change. Our peace builders have to operate in reality, because as I said there at the start, state interests will still play a dominant role in a conflict, and you have to accept that fact and work with it. But that doesn't mean you can't believe in the future and in changing people's behavior, perspectives, and understandings of one another. And so I'll just wrap up again that the logical conclusion of any war is the reestablishment of peace. And so absolutely. I'm happy to take questions.
Absolutely. All right. All right. Well, I'm going to hand it over to the audience first.
I'm curious about several aspects of USIP. It's relatively new to me because I've lived in D.C. and you have that beautiful white building now that overlooks Constitution Avenue, and it's become a big part of our image, I think, of that area physically. And there have been many events there. But what I didn't understand about it, and I'm still not sure I understand, is how does USIP fit between what the State Department does and what the United Nations does, and in terms of how it trains people to peace builders, which I assume have to be multilingual or should be from those regions in which they're attempting to go back to try to implement ideas. Do you bring those folks from these areas? Do you bring people from Afghanistan, bring them here and train them? based on a certain kind of, I don't know if there's a boot camp or there's certain rigors or if there's leadership that preaches a certain approaches to peace building? How do you prepare people, and where do you recruit them from and then send them out, and then what are their requirements? Like, since in the State Department we have certain assignments, right? It's like diplomats. So how do those people develop a relationship through USIP, and then how are they dispersed?
Well, let me go back to my experiences in Iraq. In 2004, the Congress passed the first war supplemental, and there was a line in there that gave USIP $10 million for 2 years. And the basic guidance we received from the Congress was, okay, you guys have done so much research on peace building, and you write about it, and you have scholars and things like that. If you know so much, go do something on the ground. So we went to Baghdad, and we established an office, a field office in Baghdad that was not part of the embassy. We were not inside that compound. We had to provide for our own security, had to provide for our own staff. And the way that we attracted the staff was that we just opened up shop, and people began, Iraqis began to ask questions about us. And we would explain our work and that we were trying to hire a staff. And in the first year, we hired 6 Iraqis who were bilingual to work for us. And we brought them to another regional country where we provided training. And they went back to Iraq, and with their new skills, they began to go out, because at this time in Iraq at this particular time, civil society organizations were beginning to spring up all over the country. The oppressive nature of Saddam's dictatorship was now gone. And people, given that newfound freedom that they could actually express their thoughts publicly, could then start forming groups for whatever the reason might be. And there were literally hundreds of these groups popping up. And the staff would go out and they would attend meetings and hear what these groups were doing. And based on what they were hearing, they would then come back and say, we think there might be a group we might be interested in working with. Or we heard this individual speak at some event, and we think he or she might make a good conflict facilitation expert. Once we gathered those individuals, we identified these 24 individuals, we brought them back out of Iraq again because it was safer to do the training outside of Iraq than in Iraq. And we trained them. And we trained them intensively to be conflict facilitators. And they would go back into Iraq, and when we were asked to be involved someplace in Iraq, Americans wouldn't do it. It would be our facilitators, a very dedicated group of Iraqis who were focused on trying to make their country a better place. They came from all faiths, all sects. We had Turkmen, we had Arab, we had Kurds, all participating in this. So it wasn't exclusively just one group or another. It got to a point where these people who lived all over Iraq would call one another when something popped up. The example that I remember well was at the University of Mosul. One night, campus violence just broke out, and people were shooting at each other, and one of our facilitators lived up there, and he called his colleague in Kirkuk and said, can you come up and help me? And so the next day this guy came up from Kirkuk, and they sat down with the groups of Iraqi or of university students that were fighting each other, and they did their analysis. They got underneath the topical issue to try and find what was really driving the issue, and they were able to resolve it quite quickly. And what was the issue that started all the shooting? It was like West Side Story. 2 boys were fighting over a girl, and then they brought in their bigger gangs, and that's what sparked bigger violence in a country where guns are everywhere and it's no problem to use guns. We were used for another situation that was during the height of the Civil War, as I call it. I was there in 2007 at the start of the surge, and my chief of party that I had there was asked to go out to Mahmoudiyah. Now, if you understand how Iraq is organized, there is a province of Baghdad, and it has 15 districts, like counties here. Mahmoudiyah is one of them. And it is an extremely rich agricultural area. And over the years, Saddam had been giving the agricultural land away to his cronies, which meant that you had this growing Sunni-Shia divide between the residents of the city of Mahmoudiyah and the outlying farms where the money-making was. In 2004, Al-Qaeda took over Mahmoudiyah, and the Grand Sheikhs who lived there fled to Amman. And in 2007, when the surge began, an American infantry brigade with an Iraqi brigade went in there, and working with the Shia mayor, was able to drive Al-Qaeda out. And the mayor said, hey, this is great. Here's an opportunity. And remember those 5 things I talked about? Good governance, sustainable economy, good rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. He said, geez, with them gone, let's restart the market. Now, the market is in the city, and many of the people who own the stalls in the market and whatnot were Shia. And that for them to sell something, they'd have to work with the farmers, who were all Sunni. And the Sunni farmers said, we can't talk to you. We need the approval of our Grand Sheikhs, who were all in Amman. So my chief of party went out there, and he did his analysis of the conflict situation and discovered that without that approval from those 6 men in Amman, there was not going to be any movement. So we had to put a team together, an American and Iraqi team, to go to Amman to meet with the sheikhs. To make a long story short, they went. They were able to convince the sheikhs to approve the interplay between the 2 sides in Mahmoudiyah, and they went back. And that facilitated a dialogue. Now, when we began the dialogue session, it was hosted by our Iraqi facilitators at the Iraqi Army base. We were told 42 sheikhs would show up. 114 showed up. And the lesson here, for me at least, was that these people were tired of fighting. But they had gone through 2 generations of an extremely brutal dictatorship, and they didn't know how to resolve conflict. To resolve conflict in Iraq meant you shot the guy you had a problem with and threw his body in the street, and that was that. So here was this new way of trying to resolve conflict. Once they sat down and began to talk about resolving the issues of reopening the market and getting the economy started, they began to think then, well, what about the rule of law system here? And what about our schools and clinics, stores, and a whole range of things? And suddenly, what began as a very narrowly defined initiative became broader. And they wrote an agreement between their 2 sides that they signed actually in Baghdad on national television. And it became known as the Mahmoudiyah process. It still holds firm today. These 2 sides, they have their differences, but at least they're not shooting each other now. They talk about their differences and they try to resolve them in a peaceful manner. One of the goals of the Institute was to enhance national security and reduce the cost to the government, right? I talked about that earlier. I said an American brigade had joined this effort to clear out Al-Qaeda. They cleared Al-Qaeda rather quickly, but then there was this continuing violence, Sunni on Shia violence in the district. In the first 6 months that American brigade was there, it suffered upwards of 90 IED attacks. They had 34 killed in the first 6 months and more than 250 wounded, which, when you get down to it, that's some really heavy losses. once we were invited to come in and begin the facilitation process, and once we got the Sunnis and the Shi'i to start talking to one another, that American brigade for its last 6 months there suffered only one more IED attack and one more death. Now, I'm not going to say the Institute of Peace can lay claim to all of that, but it is an interesting statistic that once we were able to get the belligerents to talk to one another, the violence dropped dramatically.
I'm still a little confused if you don't.
We're not part of the executive branch. The State Department's part of the executive branch. The State Department, if you want to know the position of the United States of America on a particular international relations issue, you talk to the Department of State. We have no comment on it. We don't do that. Look at it as a layered effort where you have a strategic actor who's responsible for the foreign relations of the United States around the world. That is clearly the Department of State. If you want to talk about development, that is the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. We do conflict. We don't do foreign relations. We don't do information about the United States and what it stands for and things of that nature. We deal with the issues of conflict and how to manage it. Certainly, we align ourselves as much as we can with both the Department of State and the Department of Defense, because they clearly know where America is supposed to be going on the international scene, and we want to be supportive of those efforts, but we let them take the lead on that. We may be asked by those departments to undertake projects, things that they cannot do, and if it's in line with our capabilities and our goals, then yes, we'll do that. And sometimes, because we're a federal agency, they can transfer money to us for that kind of work. Let me give you an example here. If you go into the Department of State, you're not going to find an office that deals with the issues of religion and conflict. If you go to USIP, we deal with the issues of religion and conflict. You know, it's not in our national character, it's not in our national decision-making body to handle issues that are based on religion and that lead to conflict. But that's something that we can do. American officials in the executive branch are prohibited from doing certain activities. For example, in Iraq, they could not leave the embassy compound. Yet I lived outside of it. And there came a time during the Civil War where virtually no Iraqi worked in the American embassy. They had either quit out of fear of their lives or they had been killed. Yet my staff came to work with us all the time. And so I'd get calls from the embassy asking if they could talk to one of our staff so that they could get an idea of what was going on outside of the green zone, because my staff lived outside of the green zone. They had to come through extremely violent areas and go through the checkpoints daily to come into work. You know, there were some days I would inform them, don't come to work, it's just too violent.
They were all Iraqi?
They were all Iraqis, all Iraqis. And now our staff is upwards of about 20 or so now working over there. We have a field office today that's been operating since 2002 in Kabul, doing similar kinds of work. And it's mostly Afghans. We only have 2 Americans there.
Is there engagement, excuse me, is there engagement there with the Taliban? We hear talks of every so often of the administration kind of going back and forth about, you know, being in conversation or, you know, some sort of, you know, diplomacy, if you will, conversations with the Taliban, maybe to try and, you know, instead of being in military conflict constantly, but to have some sort of diplomacy. And is there any involvement with USIP in that regard?
We do not work directly with the Taliban.
Okay.
That is something that would put us in the conflict resolution world of a state trying to negotiate with a belligerent, and that's not what we do.
Right.
We do facilitate dialogue between belligerent parties at the local and
right.
provincial level.
Right.
Now,
yeah.
if some of them happen to be Taliban, it's not like they wear it on an arm.
Exactly. So no official.
Some of our best work has been in helping to resolve traditional-based disputes, usually about ownership of land and things of that nature.
Right. Right.
And it's really just facilitating the dialogue between groups that have difficulty meeting with one another. So,
was there any, in terms of, examples of speaking with insurgent groups in Iraq, or, concerning belligerent groups, or,
everybody,
formally, but
everybody in Iraq at one point or another knows somebody or has participated in some group that has contributed to the violence, because the violence in Iraq was endemic. I did have a staffer who chose to leave us because he found that his loyalty to the tribe he was from was greater in his view than to what we had to do, and it was because of the family ties. One thing that Americans do not understand very well is the tribal system in the Arab world. And this young man's father was a sheikh of a tribe that had been attacked by another tribe, and he was duty-bound to defend his father, and in doing so he felt he could not be part of a peace-building process any longer, and so he left us, which was unfortunate, but those things happen. From my time in the military, I know that we talked with sheikhs who were part of the insurgency, because that's just how you had to deal with issues on the ground there. If you're interested in stopping the violence, sometimes you have to talk with some nefarious characters.
Right. I mean, I guess this is why I'm asking the question, because it is sometimes necessary. I mean, we can't just constantly have a
no. You can't
posture.
You can't put them off.
Right.
If you're going to try and facilitate some kind of dialogue. Now, let me also add that the Department of State has a list of terrorist groups that we're not allowed to talk to, and we don't.
Right.
And I've looked over that list several times, and to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, I've never met anybody associated with those.
Right.
But when you're talking about militias that are based on mosques affiliation in Baghdad, who are fighting to defend their districts from what they perceive to be threats, that's a different thing altogether.
Right. Maybe the greater majority, too, of folks and citizens on the ground in society that are going to be mostly impacted rather than specific groups, per se. I think that the one takeaway from this whole conversation and your talk today for me is that USIP is providing an alternative to violence in response to conflict, disputes. I think that this is hugely needed in several parts of the world. Instead of picking up a weapon, using what we already have, which is, our voice and our ability to, negotiate and explain ourselves and express our needs. And I think this is very powerful and so necessary. Can you talk a little bit about the inception of USIP, when it all started, and under which administration? And
the idea of USIP began in the Carter administration, And the Senate convened a commission to look at the idea of establishing what people wanted to be a peace academy, because you had the military academy, the Air Force Academy, Navy Academy, and there were members of the Senate who said we should have a peace academy. And this was in the aftermath of Vietnam. The commission eventually got to the point where it was recommending the establishment of an organization, and that was during the early years of the Reagan administration. Senator Spark Matsunaga of Hawaii was a proponent of this, and he was a combat veteran of World War II. He had fought with Senator Inouye in the 442nd in Italy. He understood war, and he thought there needed to be something that would better help America understand conflict and how to manage it and prevent war. And so he was getting ready to retire from the Senate, and as the Senate tradition usually is, you give a senator, a retiring senator, a wish. And his wish was the establishment of this. But the deal was it couldn't be called an academy, so it became the U.S. Institute of Peace. And it was a very small organization. It had 7 people. It was established in 1984, had an office up here on N Street, I believe, and then down in the Chemical Building, and then across the street in the National Restaurant Association building before we moved into this new building here. Currently, we are about a little under 300 people operating around the world on any given day. We have perhaps 25 to 30% of our workforce deployed. So we go around the world quite a bit in many different places. We support organizations that request our assistance, whether it's the Europeans through OSCE or the African Union, where we do training for peacekeeping forces that are going to Somalia or to Darfur to keep the peace there. We've done work in the Balkans, in the Philippines, in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Colombia, Iraq, obviously, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Korea. You know, we're everywhere. We do not just willy-nilly choose to go into a place. We have to be asked to partner with someone there, either the government or some substantial organization that has a reputation. We also have to ask ourselves, what is it that we can realistically achieve? You know, we can't just go into every place where there's conflict and say, here we are, we'll do some work. We don't have a lot of resources. We're a very small budget organization. We operate on less than $39 million a year. So it's, but it's a big bang for the buck, we think. You know.
Agreed. So yes.
I just want to ask you about the biggest of them all, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on for 60 years. Several U.S. presidents personally attempted to resolve the issue. The UN passed resolutions and so on. It has obviously religious overtone, which would be of interest to you. The major issues are borders, Jerusalem, water rights, refugees, and so on. Based on your analysis, what are the prospects for resolving this conflict, and if your institute in any way get involved? Thank you.
Our institute has an ongoing Arab-Israeli initiative that focuses specifically on the issues of the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. And what you have just named off, the issues of borders, of Jerusalem, of water, of right of return, things of that nature, these are all topics that we're always looking at. It's hard to facilitate a process when the facts on the ground are not conducive to that. One of the things that we can do at the Institute of Peace is convene groups of, I'd call them graybeards, you know, the wise old people, you know, who come in and on a non-attribution basis discuss these various issues and try to make recommendations to administrations in a very quiet, off-the-record fashion. so that they can provide an administration new ideas in a way that the administration can use it or not use it. It's their call, but we don't make a big deal out of that. We have done that for the Middle East. We're doing it for other parts of the world today that you read about in the news. But it's because we are a nonpartisan kind of entity that we can do this kind of convening. It all goes back to the 90s, the mid-90s, when the UN was the big issue with the U.S. government, and people wanted to kill the U.S. role in the United Nations unless there was some kind of reform. And so Congress asked us to undertake a commission to look at how to reform the United Nations. And it was chaired by Senator George Mitchell and former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. I mean, can you imagine a more diametrically opposed pair?
Very interesting.
But they produced a very good report. When Congress was frustrated about the war effort in Iraq, they asked us to manage the Iraq study group led by former Secretary of State James Baker and former Representative Lee Hamilton. And in fact, I took the Iraq study group to Baghdad in 2006 to ensure that they had an Iraqi perspective of what was going on, so that they wouldn't hear just what the Americans were thinking. We have done that on the other commissions that you have named, and we have assisted on the State Department's QDDR, helped facilitate that process. So we do a lot of that, but specifically on Israel and the Palestinian Authority issue, that remains a tough nut to crack. And I don't think anybody who's involved in that kind of work will lack for future work.
Yes.
So any prospects in your estimation for resolution anytime soon?
I'm not an expert enough in that, but based on my military background, my personal opinion, I don't see that being resolved anytime soon. You know, if you want to facilitate a dialogue, it requires having at least two sides willing to talk to each other.
Yes, Father Weiss.
You might have seen in the Washington Post a few days ago there was an article about retiring Congressman Kucinich. And among other things, he spoke of his conviction that sooner or later there will be a cabinet-level Department of Peace. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not a popular idea. His proposal has never gotten out of committee. One might say, well, anybody from the USIP will automatically favor such an idea, but you know, there's a lot of talk these days about a bloated bureaucracy and even reducing the number of departments rather than adding still one more. Yeah. What would you say are the pros and cons of Kucinich's notion, and would you think it will, in fact, ever become reality?
It's a notion that has been around for a long, long time. In fact, if you go back to the will of George Washington, he even mentions that there should be some kind of establishment, a part of the U.S. government that focuses on peace issues. And in fact, the land that we are built on, technically, was his property. You know, and actually, here's a nickel bag of knowledge thing for you. That is where a military campaign began in 1753. General Braddock landed his British soldiers there and began the march to a place called Fort Duquesne. Now, Braddock didn't survive the campaign, but he had a young Virginian militiaman who was helping guide him through the woods, a guy named George Washington. So, but back to your question. The Department of Peace, as I understand it from what the news has covered, is much more expansive than our charter permits us to be, because he thinks it should have a domestic role to play here in the United States. We are prohibited from doing that kind of work here in the United States. We focus strictly on the international arena. It's a skills, I mean, it's the kind of work that I think local governments can handle, but they need training. There are ways that they are getting that training. We had gone out to Chicago back in 2005 or 6 and actually had some of our staff go with some of the anti-gang task forces that were working the south side of Chicago, actually at night go walk the streets to try and talk to the gang members and whatnot. There are ways that's working.
Yeah.
We did it just so we were familiar with their techniques to see if that might have a role to play in Baghdad. Unfortunately, it didn't. It was just an entirely different scene. But as far as the establishment of a Department of Peace, I leave that to Congress and the executive branch to sort that out. We're very low-level people that just focus on conflict management, international conflict management.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say something about, you had mentioned in your talk about being proactive, and I think that this is something I am seeing actually more and more. I have now been in Washington a little over 6 years, and understanding and following USIP for about as long, and just seeing the proactive programs increase, and I think this is very important information. And can you speak more to this?
Well, yeah, there are a couple of different ways we're tackling this. We have in our organization the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding, our education arm. We also have a Center for Conflict Management, and this center is the one that does the overview of the world and has the country-specific teams and programs. That's where our Iraq program is managed, for Afghanistan, etc. It's very state-focused, okay? But the future, the proactive things, actually go into our other center, the Center of Innovation, where we look at transnational dynamics, the role of gender in peace building, the role of media and science and technology in peace building, sustainable economies, the security sector reform, rule of law, things of that nature that inform us where there could be problems, so that we could look at that and say, okay, maybe there's some way we can reach out and touch someone there and just invite them to come see us, and we can explain what we see. It's an extremely important thing to do, especially if it's transnational. I mean, you mentioned water resources in the Middle East. Absolutely. But how many people know that Egypt today is the largest importer of grain in the Middle East? And with China's love of beef, because now Chinese people can't afford the luxury of beef, they're consuming more beef, drives up the requirement for grain to be cattle feed, which reduces the supply for the largest Arab nation in the world. And when that supply is reduced, the cost goes up for the consumer. And now you find that Egyptians are having a tough time trying to afford bread.
And on top of it, the ethanol, 1/3 of the corn acres is devoted to
ethanol now here in the United States, because it makes a better profit for farmers. So these are the sorts of things that we're trying to suss out and look at that and say, wow, if somebody doesn't try to do something about this, then you're going to have a problem. Now we collaborate. We don't collaborate, I guess is the wrong word, but we stay in touch with the World Bank and the IMF, because they have experts that look at this stuff on a daily basis. We also have a program that we've just begun this year where we're bringing in experts from the executive branch for in-house residencies. So today, for example, we have a senior staffer from the Department of Agriculture residing at USIP, studying these very issues. And we have somebody from USAID, and we have a former ambassador from the State Department who is with us.
I imagine it's very important to be working together or collaborating with these different agencies, because you need to have the input, and they have information, and you have information that they need, and vice versa.
We also have Army officers and Navy officers who work at USIP on these very issues.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today, and I highly encourage our audience to visit the United States Institute of Peace website at usip.org. Yes, thank you so much for joining us today.